What would you do if your dog found a beautiful relic? The story of today's video is all about the themes of discovery and morals, and we hope that you find it intriguing. Of course, just like so many of the stories that we love to feature on the channel, this one also includes a brilliant dog committed to doing all that it can to impress its owners. Whether you're a dog person or not, we're sure that you'll love this story just as much as we do. The main character of today's story, Brian, has always been a wealthy man. However, no matter what he acquires, he will always be lucky to have a dog that is loyal and loving towards him, a dog that would do anything to be by his side. However, as time goes on, Brian eventually becomes aware of something unusual. His dog is no longer the ordinary pup that he once knew. There's something up, and he's determined to get to the bottom of it. Brian had always felt lucky to have Mario by his side. He couldn't recall what had prompted him to give the dog such a peculiar name, and yet he never regretted it. Somehow, it was just the right fit. If nothing else, it was creative, something that others would always ask him about. The last thing he wanted for his dog was for it to have the same name as every other pet in the country. Brian had never been much of a fan of fitting in with the crowd. In spite of his choice in giving Mario his unique name, the behavior of the elegant Labrador never seemed to be much out of the ordinary. All the while, Brian had been quite content with this. After all, soon after adopting Mario as a puppy, all of his friends seemed to fall in love with his new pet. He always behaved wherever he went, whoever he met. Sometimes, it was almost a little strange, as much as Brian had to appreciate it. There were times that Brian felt like Mario wasn't much of a dog at all. He would often wake up to see everything in the house perfectly tidy. This was far from what his friends had described when they all got dogs for the first time. Even in these moments, Brian was sure to remain cautious. Maybe this was how it started when you got a new pet. Perhaps his new furry friend was waiting to test the boundaries. As much as he told himself that he was being a little paranoid, he could not find it in himself to shake this fear. It was paralyzing. As much as he felt this, however, Mario's behavior did not change in the slightest. Day in and day out, his friend remained as loyal and well-behaved as one could imagine. It was truly incredible. Until, one day, of course, things were turned upside down completely. It was a situation that Brian could never have expected in all these years. Thoughts flooded from his mind as he made his way down the stairs that morning. All of his plans for the day were completely forgotten as he saw the state of the rooms below. There would usually be a stack of newspapers and magazines stowed at the center of the dinner table. He never knew quite why he did this, but it was totally irrelevant now. The vast collection that had amassed was now strewn through the expanse of the house. At first, Brian was forced to believe that he had been burgled. Surely it could be the only explanation for the chaos that had unfolded here. And yet, he had heard nothing. He rushed onto the front door, mind scrambling now as he tried to latch onto a conclusion. There was nothing. Absolutely zero indication that someone had tried to break into his place. Was this all just a bad dream? Increasingly, he was beginning to wish that it was so. Dreadfully, however, he was confident that this wasn't the case. There was something truly strange going on here, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it as soon as possible. Where was Mario now? For a moment, Brian had the idea that the dog was pursuing whoever had done this. But then, he realized that this couldn't have been any further from the truth. The culprit was now walking right towards him. Brian could barely speak as he saw his dog steadily making his way toward him. Brian called out to Mario instantly, and yet, as much as he wanted to reprimand the dog, he was sure already that something had gone wrong. As much as Mario seemed content as usual, he was positive that something had happened. What could have possibly led to this behavior? As he stared breathlessly at the dog once again, a part of him truly wanted to believe that Mario wasn't responsible. And yet, no one could mistake the torn part of the newspaper that was coiled around one of the dog's paws. What could explain this? As much as Brian wanted to shout, to lament the state that his house was in, he knew that it was all worthless in the end. Even with all of the emotions that rushed through him, somehow he was able to reflect on all the time that he had spent with the dog. Across all of the years, all the time, he could not recall a single instance that he had shouted at his pet. Feeling this sense of anger made him quite uneasy. Where could he go from here? In the end, he decided to move toward the dog and tried to collect Mario up in his arms. Even if he couldn't repair the mess that the house was in right now, he could at least do his best to ensure that the culprit didn't do any more damage. To his dismay, however, this was far from Mario's plans. The second that Brian started to move towards the dog, Mario had already turned, sending the scraps of newspapers flying up in every direction. Instantly, Brian knew that pursuit was useless as the dog bolted out into the garden. Why was the door open in the first place? Feeling more lost than ever, he knew that he had no choice but to chase Mario once again. He hoped that all of this would be over soon, but somehow he knew that this was just the beginning. Whatever it was that had set the dog off, it must have been something serious. Before Brian could even shout out in protest, Mario had already started to dissect the ground that lay in front of him, spraying soil and grass in all directions as he burrowed his way through the surface. "Stop!" he yelled. "You need to stop now!" What was happening? Barely believing what he had witnessed, Brian felt that he had no other option but to haul Mario away from the garden. Once he had gathered the dog in his arms, he hurried back to the house, placing his pet inside before closing the door firmly. Finally, he felt like he could breathe again. Hopefully, this would be the last time that he would have to experience something like this. As much as he was grateful for all of this to be over, there was nothing that could stop him from fearing something greater. Naturally, there was a very large question that still remained. What exactly was he going to do to stop this from happening in future? Still, he was no closer to learning what exactly had prompted this behavior in Mario. What had happened to the dog that he thought he knew so well? The dog that had always seemed like more of a personal assistant. Thinking fast, Brian shot a look back towards the house, now fearful that the dog would simply return to destroying the house instead of the garden. To his relief, once again, Mario was simply sitting there, licking his paws as he watched his owner intently. Despite himself, Brian could not help the hot resentment that came with watching his dog act in this way. Could Mario not see that he was tearing everything apart? Doing his best to brush all of this to one side, Brian turned and walked towards the latest of his problems. It was all of the ground that Mario had dug up after fleeing from the house. He was not looking forward to this, but knew that he had to sort it out quickly. As he stood before the hole in the ground, he couldn't help but feel his dismay reach a whole new level. He could barely understand how the dog had managed to make so much progress in such a short time. What had Mario been looking for? Was it perhaps something that he had smelled down there? Something strange? After grabbing a spade from the tool shed, Brian regretfully got to work, hoping with all this heart that there was something worthwhile under all of this mess. More than anything, he wanted to find something valuable, something that would hopefully exonerate Mario. He had to know that this wasn't all for nothing, that the dog was actually searching with purpose. It didn't take long for Brian's muscles to ache as he drove the spade in and out of the surface, sending soil in every direction, just as Mario had done only moments before. He wondered what Mario was thinking as he saw his owner digging desperately out in the garden. Perhaps he saw this as a game that the two were playing. Throughout the entirety of the dog's childhood, playing in the garden had been a huge part of their relationship, some of the most gleeful moments of the pet's life. Sure enough, Mario was transfixed by what was unfolding in front of him as he watched patiently through the glass door. Perhaps the dog was wondering what Brian would find as well. Before long, Brian felt himself starting to tire at an unprecedented rate. Every now and again, he found himself taking a break or two. But now, as time wore on, he was forced to spend more time resting than digging. Once more, adamant that this couldn't be for nothing, and that Mario indeed had a reason to cause this mess, he rushed back to the house. Mario was totally gleeful as he welcomed back into the expanse of the garden, barking excitedly as he ran out to the spot that he had discovered some hours ago now. By this point, it was more than obvious to Brian that he needed some help if he was going to get this done before sundown. "Just a few more feet," he said to himself through gritted teeth. There had to be something here. There just had to be. As a team, the dog and his owner were setting a tremendous pace. Instead of digging at the same time, Brian was soon able to hatch a better idea. He would start by doing 1-minute bursts of effort, digging as much as he could, tossing the remainder of soil over ground, before then leaping out and allowing Mario to dig as fast as he could. Of course, he could not remember a time that he had seen his dog act in this way before. In many ways, he was surprised that Mario had the vigor to dig with such ferocity. As much as it was natural for most dogs to act in this way, Brian knew as well as anyone that his dog was quite different from most. "Keep going, boy," Brian said, now feeling quite unaccustomed to encouraging his dog after all that had happened today. Even in spite of the stress that coursed through his body, it was somewhat relieving to goad his friend. It brought him far more joy than all of the shouting, that was for sure. He soon became so caught up in encouraging Mario, and Mario so caught up in the digging, that Brian eventually forgot that his dog's time was now up. It was way past his own time to dig. Just as he went down to lift Mario from the hole, however, he heard a dreadful scraping noise. It was unmistakable. It couldn't be anything else except the dog's paws scraping against something solid. At long last, the gigantic mass of soil had been exhausted. There was something else here. Still, however, Brian had to remind himself not to get too excited. There was still a huge possibility that this had been a complete waste of time. Heart racing, he was now petrified of looking down into the hole and seeing nothing but a slab of concrete. Even worse than this, he could only imagine what the neighbours would say if Spade split a pipe or something like that. That would be the last thing he needed on a day like this. He could only imagine their complaints as he made his way down. No, he couldn't afford for that to happen. Still, Mario kept his wide smile as Brian reached the bottom, now feeling the full extent of his fatigue. If there was one thing for sure, it was that he wouldn't be doing anything like this again. Squatting painfully, Brian dove his hand towards the center, brushing away what remained of the soil. "Come on," he said to himself under his breath. "There's got to be something worthwhile here." Just as he was ready to dismiss their little mission entirely, he found his hand brush against something strange. Now, doing his best impression of Mario, he scrambled through the dirt, uncovering the remains that lay beneath. Almost in an instant, he withdrew, pulling out something that made him freeze with shock. Mario's light barks had been reduced to nothing as he held it up to the light that remained in the sky. It was a bone. Although he was far from an expert, Brian could only come to the conclusion that this was a femur bone. It was far too long to be any other part of a human body. Just as this wonder gripped, it wasn't long before another emotion entirely took over. This was what he wanted at all. What had taken place for all of this to happen? Had he bought a house that lay on top of a graveyard? His heart, that only moments ago had been full of hope and optimism, had now fallen dramatically. Then there came something else, the morbid reality of what he had uncovered today. Up until this point, all that he had felt was disappointment, but now he could fully acknowledge the gravity of what he felt in his hand. The bone was browned and ancient. Perhaps it came as a consolation to him that the person had not died recently. Still, however, Mario was not convinced that their little project had come to an end. Although the dog was no longer able to dig any deeper, this did not stop Mario from brushing the remainder of the soil away. Clearly, he knew that there was something more here, something that Brian had missed entirely. Soon enough, Brian's silence was broken completely. Before long, Mario had stumbled across something that made him squirm. Naturally, he knew that a full human skeleton was not out of the question, and yet there were many peculiar things about it that would surely have to be investigated. Bizarrely, The skeleton was very well preserved. There were very parts of the structure missing as Brian stared down at what the dog had uncovered. He felt himself tremble a little as his eyes raked over the remains until, finally, he found something that made him stop once again. It was a necklace. At least, that was what he thought it was. It stood in deep contrast with the rest of the remains. While the bones looked as though they had perhaps been there for hundreds of years, the necklace had surely been placed there days ago. In fact, he could barely see any evidence of dirt or wear. How was any of this possible? When it came to the materials that the necklace was crafted from, things just became all the more mysterious and intriguing. Barely able to contain his excitement now, Brian ran his fingers over the artifact. It seemed all too good to be true now. Was it gold? Even in the dying sunlight, the rubies that studded the necklace blazed. He could barely count all of the precious stones that found themselves dotted over the piece of jewelry. After all of the effort, the only thing on his mind now was the prospect of money. He could only imagine how much he could get for this if he tried to sell it. For the very first time during the expedition into the depths of the garden, he shared the very same delighted expression as Mario. It seemed that his luck had finally started to turn, at long last. Now, watching the necklace unfurl in his hand, the only thought that remained on Brian's mind was how he was going to clean up all of this mess. Within an instant, he had dismissed this completely. Now that he had found this, he could no longer care for what the neighbors had to say. He was going to be rich, and there was nothing that their words could do about that. With a smirk, he watched as Mario bounded off back toward the house. Spectacularly, he could see that darkness was falling now. There were just a precious few moments left where he could admire the jewelry in natural light. Anyways, he was sure that he could discover more about the necklace tomorrow. As much as he tried to get to sleep that night, there were just too many thoughts. Thoughts about everything that could go wrong. No matter how many times he told himself that everything was okay, there was still no way for him to free his mind of all this. Deep down, no matter how many times he tried to deny it, he knew that he was doing something wrong here, something that his conscience didn't quite agree with. As he sprung out of bed, he tore towards the drawer where he had placed the necklace, all of his senses firing as he grabbed a torch and examined it once more. Just as before, he was still utterly convinced that it was a piece of great value. Perhaps his only real fear now was one of greed. There was still a horrible feeling inside him. Did he really know that the necklace was capable of making him rich? Even now, he could envisage himself going into a pawnbroker and learning that the thing was worthless. Every last detail was revealed to him, down to the expression on the broker's face as he told him that he was wrong. No, he thought. Before long, he was speaking to himself again, sure to impress that he couldn't be wrong now. Not after the day I've had, he said to no one, looking around desperately. He could not help the sense that he was being watched. As day broke once again, Brian felt that today might be as chaotic as the one before. As much as he had to hope for the best, he was now convinced that things would not be as easy as he once thought. At least there was one thing that was going his way. Mario was behaving himself. After all that had happened, that was at least a luxury, and he was grateful for it. A part of him wanted to embrace the dog as he saw Mario return to his usual self, content, but not overly energized as he had been yesterday. Just as he had this thought, however, he knew that there were more pressing things to attend to right now. One thing was for certain. It was his mission to find the true value of the necklace that he held in his hands. At that moment, as much as he wanted to get the local pawnbroker on the phone, he could not help the sense that there were other things that had to be explored here. After all, he was still curious about why there was a body lying in his back garden. The necklace wasn't going anywhere. He could find some other answers now. After he had called the archaeologist and told him what he had uncovered, the man seemed barely capable of containing his excitement. As soon as Brian welcomed him at the door, he again barely held back his flurry of questions. "It's okay," Brian said through a smile. "I've already dug up the remains completely. You'll find everything that you need out there," now gesturing out into the garden. Just like Mario had done those days ago, the young archaeologist burst through the house as soon as he was given permission to do so, not even stopping to remove his shoes as he sprung into the garden at an athletic pace. It was Brian that shared the same amazement now as he closely tailed the man, watching on as he saw the professional get to work. Before long, the archaeologist had produced a range of materials from his satchel, donning a pair of technical-looking gloves as he dove into the hole that Brian and Mario had created. Soon enough, however, just as Brian came to believe that the man was making good progress, he saw his head pop up from the ground. Was there something else? His voice was light and innocent. Straight away, Brian could not help but feel the tinge of guilt. He was not sure what the archaeologist had expected to find, but now he was more sure than ever that he knew the area well. The man knew that something special had to lay here, and Brian was hiding it in his pocket. In that moment, Brian felt a pull away from his instincts. As much as he was sure that the necklace held great worth, he knew that he would likely regret it if he lied to the man's face. Regardless, from the excitement that the archaeologist brought, he was sure that there were even further wonders to explore here. Perhaps there would still be a way to profit from the situation somehow. "Yes," Brian said. "Yes, there is something else that you need to see." The man seemed as elated as Brian had been when he saw the necklace for the first time. "I believe that it's a medallion, actually," the man began. "Yes, we have been searching for this kind of thing for quite some time now." Brian, even as he spoke to the man before him, could not help but feel a little let down by the whole situation, especially after all that he had experienced. No matter though, regardless of what he thought, he was now sure that he had made a discovery which would change this man's life. Now, he could only wonder where things would go from here. As always, guys, we hope that you enjoyed this video and can't wait to see you in the next one. Until then, have a great day.
If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider sharing it with someone who may find it interesting. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.